Hello, everyone. You are watching the Asian American Herald, a new media network. This show is being aired live via live stream on Facebook, and a recording will be available afterwards at our Facebook page, Asian American Herald. My name is Himanee Gupta-Carlson, and I'm a professor at Empire State College in Saratoga Springs, New York, as well as a community-based farmer and writer. So before we begin, I'd like to open our show tonight with my weekly tribute to the Haudenosaunee, the people of the Longhouse, who are the original caretakers of much of upstate New York, where the Asian American Herald is based. In making this tribute, I also acknowledge myself as a settler, and I thank the Haudenosaunee for providing me shelter. And tonight, I am very pleased to introduce my Empire State colleague, Dr. Erin Young. Dr. Young is an associate professor in cultural studies and literature. She is based on Long Island, and her research and teaching interests focus on popular romance novels, science fiction, and Asian American literature. Erin, welcome to our show.
Thank you so much for having me, Himanee.
Oh, it's a pleasure. So you and I actually this year have shared space a few times as speakers for the college's Reason and Respect series, as well as the anti-racism plenary for a virtual residency. And each time that the introductions go around, I find out that you earned your bachelor's degree from the University of Alaska. And I'm wondering, maybe if we could just start by talking about that. How did you come to be in Alaska? And what was the experience of being Asian American in Alaska like?
Sure. So I actually lived there for quite a long time. We moved there when I was 9 years old. So my dad was Air Force. And my dad, by the way, is white American. My mother is a Korean immigrant. So we moved around a lot before we got to Alaska. We lived in Texas, Michigan, South Korea, and Wyoming before I got to Alaska. And actually, just a few things before we got there. Some of my more disturbing, I guess, Asian American experiences kind of preceded. Wyoming was actually the worst for me. The reason being that when I was in South Korea, I attended kindergarten there and part of first grade, and it was on an Air Force base, Osan Air Force Base in Seoul, where every kid in my class was half Korean and half something else. And so I really thought all kids just kind of looked like that. And then I went to Wyoming. Cheyenne, Wyoming was our next move, and I was the only person of Asian descent in that class. It was primarily a white class, and that was when it became very clear to me that I was different. I was told explicitly that I was different. So by the time I got to Alaska, I was pretty shut down. Honestly, it was not a move that I wanted to make. I had a lot of moving fatigue as a child. It was always in the middle of the school year, so it was never a smooth transition. And my experience in Alaska, and of course, there are parts of Alaska that are very diverse, especially in terms of indigenous populations. We lived outside of Fairbanks, Alaska. It was Eielson Air Force Base, and we settled in this very small town called Salcha, which had about 2,000 people, and it was primarily white settlers in that area. So those were the kids I went to school with, and it was very much similar to just a rural American experience, I would say. I think it reflected that a lot. I stayed in Alaska to go to college for my bachelor's. So that was at the University of Alaska, Fairbanks. And that was actually a more diverse experience because a lot of the Alaskan Native indigenous children who attend earlier schooling in their villages will, join up with everyone else at the universities. And so I actually got to see more diverse representation at that point. But there were very few Asian Americans, and generally people responded to me initially as, "Are you Alaskan Native?" And so I was always correcting that impulse. And
Yeah, that is interesting. I grew up in the Midwest, and I was often mistaken for Black, for Mexican, for Hawaiian. Later, it was, are you from Fiji? And it's interesting that I was so many things, but not Indian American necessarily.
Sure.
Yeah.
So
It's interesting to me that you were able to kind of grow up and go to college with so many Native Alaskans and indigenous peoples of that area. And I'm
Mhm.
wondering, how did that influence your studies and your, I guess, your outlook toward academia?
I think I became more aware of the ways that my undergrad were sort of racist or white supremacist without really, just because that's how the way they were, primarily through the experiences of my Alaska Native friends, because a lot of them had a really difficult transition to university. Their patterns of speech were different, their use of silence was different, and none of it really prepared them for necessarily a competitive classroom environment where you had a lot of students just, interrupting each other to dominate discussion. And as an Asian American, that was something that I really related to. And it was something that I struggled with for a very long time. I mean, honestly, one of the scariest things about going to graduate school for me was I'm not going to be able to be silent in classes forever. I'm going to have to start talking. And then it was, okay, I'm going to have to start teaching. How can I teach without talking? I mean, these were some of the concerns that I had, because I just did not know how to converse successfully in those kinds of spaces. That was something I really had to kind of learn how to do through trial and error.
Yeah. That's also really fascinating to me. It reminds me actually of teaching in Hawaii. So I was a journalist before I was an academic, and I had to overcome my shyness because I wouldn't get the story otherwise. I had to go in there. It was basically trial by fire, and I'm still very shy in some settings, but I can do journalism. And so going to grad school I was already loud and blustery to some extent. But
Good.
yeah, well, I don't know. But when I started teaching, and teaching in Hawaii, where it is kind of an Asian dominant area,
Yeah.
I had so many students who were so quiet, and they actually would tell me they preferred lecture over any other mode of learning. They didn't want to do group work. They didn't want to do presentations. They liked lecture and they liked writing. And I thought that was
Yeah.
interesting, which makes me think about, why is the classroom space the way it is? Why is it structured so that you're supposed to be loud, you're supposed to talk a lot?
Exactly. And that was something that was always a struggle for me. I wish there were alternatives. I mean, and there were, in the sense of, like, my writing, I was always very proud of. Uh, and I knew I did good work in that way. But alternatives would be nice, because it also very much made me feel, that competitive environment in grad school made me feel. And I remember even this weird fight that happened between two of my friends, who one thought the other had kind of stolen her idea for a paper, even though they virtually had the same assignment. And it wasn't a collaborative kind of environment at all. And I didn't do any real kind of collaboration until I was at Empire State College.
Yeah,
So I think there are some real, missed opportunities, by not questioning that structure.
yeah. I wonder if that's like an opportunity for an Asian American space to kind of emerge,
Right.
perhaps across racial space, that cross racial and ethnic kind of space to emerge in classrooms that's different. But
Right.
you want to talk a little bit about your research, your work. I'm so envious of scholars that get to work with literature, and particularly things like romance novels and science fiction. Every so often, I indulge myself, and I buy or go to the library before COVID and get the young adult South Asian American books, and
Oh, cool. Yeah.
just stay up all night reading them, and kind of wishing myself to be back in that teenage life again in some ways, but
Sure.
also feeling very glad that I'm not. So I was wondering if you could just talk a bit about your interests in these areas, and how did those interests develop, and how did they come to intersect with Asian American literature?
Yeah, so these interests started out actually very pragmatic. It was simply a matter of this was again rural Alaska. I mean, we would go to town, like you would go to town for supplies. That meant we were driving into Fairbanks for 45 minutes to get supplies, and you do this like once a week. So one of the issues that I always had was I was a prolific reader, and I was always running out of things to read as a child. And it got to the point where my parents were just like, "Look, we got books here. Just find something that you can read." And what they had, what their respective interests were, was my mom read romance novels, in particular because she found them easy enough to read, but also she felt that she gained a lot of English language fluency through the act of reading romance novels.
Yeah.
And then my dad was a science fiction reader. And so those were what they had lying around the house. And I started reading them when I was like 10. And, it was weird. When I started majoring in English, I always figured I would study, quote unquote, real literature back before I ever interrogated that idea. But I always did this other reading on the side. I always considered it side reading. It was my pleasure reading is what I would call it. I'd squeeze in my romance novels or my science fiction. And one of the things that I came to start thinking about as I was thinking critically about Asian American literature is that weird situation you're in when you're a reader who's not reflected in what you're reading, and how you have to make these kinds of interesting decisions, like which characters do you suture yourself to and why, right? And I just started to really think about how important popular fiction was, especially in terms of what do people read now if they read at all? They tend to read popular fiction, right? We're not in a huge reading culture, especially in terms of like novels. So there's tremendous power in what they do. There's tremendous power in their formulas and what they attempt to resolve. And when people of color are not in those resolutions or in those stories, then we have a problem. So I started thinking about what does it look like for an Asian American protagonist to be in a romance novel. And my earliest work was actually looking at romances written by white female authors featuring white heroes and Asian heroines. And so I started really unpacking like all these strange maneuvers they had to do to get the romance to work, precisely because of these racist ideas that exist around Asians.
Yeah.
And so that was where my initial kind of work. And from there, I've been much more interested in, as more stuff emerges, in what Asian Americans themselves are doing in their interventions in these popular fiction genres.
Yeah, and there are so many Asian American writers. I think the Asian American Writers Workshop in New York has been a great source of support for that. But, just the amount of really good stuff that comes out by the week, literally. I can't even keep up with it, but it really gives you a beautiful insight into the multiplicity of cultures also that come out in Asian America.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. Yeah, I also remember reading works like Maxine Hung Kingston's Woman Warrior and Joy Luck Club by Amy Tan. And I actually read them soon after they came out. I was in my mid-20s at that point, which dates me incredibly. But I think it was like the first time I really started to see myself in these stories. And I read a lot when I was young. I read Nancy Drew. I read the Little House on the Prairie stories, and I enjoyed
those. Yeah.
Yeah, I love them and I enjoyed them, but I never was in them. And when I suddenly saw myself in the story, that was just so powerful. Yep. And so I was wondering, Asian American literature, what are its foundational values?
Yeah, and I think, for me, one of the most important things about Asian American literature, and I think there are ways you can make this argument about all of the minority literary traditions in the United States, but it's been one of the primary vehicles through which Asian Americans have been able to actually not be silent, to speak about their experiences, to give voice to them. And sometimes, especially in the early eras of publishing, when Asian Americans were writing, prior to World War II, especially, what they could do was very much influenced by the publishing industry, by the expectations of what white audiences would want to read and that kind of thing. But even in those texts, I mean, you can read between the lines and get a sense of what's going on. For me, Asian American history, like African American history, sorry for the cat in the back.
That's okay.
That's Vince.
That's me.
But I mean, this is American history, right? I mean, it's been made very invisible. And I shouldn't say history because you're an historian. I don't mean in the sense that literature functions like historical documents, but it does give historical context especially for the people whose perspectives you don't normally hear, right? The people at the bottom who are not always in positions of power where they can get their voices heard. So I think that's very important. And one thing I'll say that kind of echoes what you said about, I'll talk about the Joy Luck Club. So my first exposure to that book was actually in 1995. I read it in high school, so that tells you where I am. And it was the first time after reading that book that I thought of myself as an Asian American, that I had this sense that I was part of, sort of in the Anderson sense of imagined community, right? That through that book was the starting process of me understanding that in many ways I'd been gaslit, that all these experiences that I'd had throughout my life that were really disturbing and that I couldn't understand and that, really kind of haunted me. I started to develop a framework for understanding this, like, Asian American history, what the model minority stereotype, like all this stuff. I suddenly realized it's not just me, like there's a whole group of people. And I never had the benefit of being around other Asian Americans. So for me, the literature was everything. Yeah. And so I would say Asian American literature taught me that I was an Asian American. And that was a very important thing for my own sense of self-worth.
Yeah. Did that change when you moved out of Alaska and, into places, California, Oregon, and then, New York as well, where there are actually more Asian Americans? And so I wonder, did that alter the framework for you at all?
San Diego was I lived in San Diego after Alaska. I did my master's there. And that was a very important experience for me. That was the only time I was ever around other Asian Americans. And was around people who had a proud Asian American identity. It was also the first time I was around really outspoken Asian Americans. I mean, I don't know if you have much experience with the Southern California sort of Asian American communities, but they have numbers and they have a strong sense of, not everybody, but a strong sense of, this is who I am. I'm Filipino American. This is my heritage. And much less of that silence, which I just loved. So that was a fantastic experience. But then I moved from there to Eugene, Oregon, and it was terrible all over again.
Oh.
So, yeah.
Yeah. No, I've only visited Southern California, but I have a lot of colleagues through the Association for Asian American Studies and the Asian Pacific American Religions Research Initiative that are in Southern Cal. And so I kind of get their experience through them a lot, what they share. And last week, in fact, at the AAAS, Association for Asian American Studies conference, there was a roundtable on this forthcoming book called We Go Down Sewing. And it's about this collective that formed kind of organically at the beginning of the pandemic called the Auntie Sewing Squad. And it's basically mostly Asian American women who began making face masks out of anything and everything they could find to deliver to the Navajo reservation. And there's a very prominent Korean American comedian who kind of, I don't know if she's sort of a mover and shaker in the group. I think the group is very grassrootsy and doesn't want to sort of have anybody be ownership, but she's like the grand auntie in a way. And anyway, I'm really looking forward to reading the book when it comes out in September. But it did give me a sense of really what you can do when there are numbers around.
Right.
And so that brings us back to us. We are here at Empire State College, a very decentralized campus with, for the past year and a half, almost exclusively remote learning. And for me, it's always been online remote learning. And we are also, I think, the only Asian American professors in the arts and humanities. And I don't know about you, but I don't really actually see a lot of Asian or Asian American students.
Very few.
Yeah, and I wonder, how does that challenge us to teach Asian American studies, literature, history, politics? And, does that mirror other situations in academia elsewhere?
Right. It's interesting. I'm right in the middle of right now doing U.S. multicultural fiction online, and we finish up with Asian American fiction. So they started reading that, very shortly after the Atlanta spa shootings, and it's. I mean, part of me wonders to what extent we really need to sort of capitalize on this moment of visibility, right? Because we don't know how long it will last. But it's at the moment, I have a lot of students who are eager to understand how we got to the point where we are with the anti-Asian, hate crimes that are going on. And I think that's a good thing, but I don't know how long lasting it will be. And it is really hard. I teach Asian American writers. I maybe get 1 or 2 students a year for it as an independent study. It's definitely not the most popular course.
Yeah.
So it can be challenging, I think, to, we can't demonstrate a clear tie to the student population with it the way you can for other kinds of courses necessarily. But I do think we're at least people are starting to realize that these experiences matter and we do need to know a little bit about them. So I don't know what we can do.
Yeah.
Himanee, we got to do something.
Yeah, we do. We really do. And I just, I was reminded coming up again from the conference last week. The conference was so interesting because it was not, face to face. It was remote. We were all on Zoom, and there was this, crazy conference platform that we were all trying to figure out. And some people couldn't get into the chat, and some people couldn't raise their hands. And there was all these, interesting technological struggles. But there was also just this I almost felt like I was being hugged throughout the conference.
Yeah.
There was this incredible sense of people wanting to see each other and commune together. And it reminded me of the struggles that faculty face in their institutions, especially, east of California, where, there may be one, there may be two, there may be no other Asian Americans around. And so, it's like, how do you still remain or still feel Asian American when you're in kind of like an isolating environment like that?
Yeah, no, it's very true. I mean, in some ways, for me, because I never was used to having that really traditional community. I only had it for, maybe 3 or 4 years I was in San Diego, although I still have those friendships, but everything's remote now, of course. I've been turning to the literature a lot. I've been trying over this past year to read, except for what I had to catch up on in terms of teaching or research, solely Asian American fiction, which is not something I've done in a while. And that has helped me because, yeah, I mean, what else can we do, right? I don't have a huge network of Asian American scholars that I'm close with or anything like that. In fact, most of the Asian Americans in my life are not in academia. So it's challenging.
Yeah. And that's actually another point that's really interesting. I feel like Asian American studies, it grew out of protest. It grew out of student protest, students demanding in the 1960s and early 1970s that the curricula change, that courses be created that incorporate the stories, the histories, and the struggles of their people, that books be read that are written by and or feature characters that look like them. And so it's always been kind of punctuated by activism and protest.
Yeah.
And I wonder sometimes, is it maybe more of a field for those non-academia Asian Americans than for the academically minded person?
I mean, for me, because I came into this through the literature path, I've always felt that my work is in many ways disconnected from activism. I mean, I think the arguments that I'm making are all tied into that, and so on and so forth. But I always see sort of my scholarship as being like, I know not that many people are reading it, right? Like, it's just a few other probably romance scholars, and hopefully one of them's Asian American, but I usually don't even expect that. So yeah, I don't know. I think I need a better answer to your question, but
Well, I'm going to give you a really easy question right now.
okay.
What do you recommend we read? What do you recommend those of us who are not in literature but want to kind of either connect with or reconnect with Asian American romance, whatever, romance novels, science fiction, popular culture type novels? What do you recommend we read?
Yeah. One one thing that I think is happening in Asian American literature that's really interesting and important, and actually, Viet Thanh Nguyen talks about this a bit in Race and Resistance, and he talks about it a lot in his videos. I do highly recommend The Sympathizer, by the way. But he chose to write in the spy novel form. And one of the reasons he made that decision is because he also sees that sort of utility for what we can do with popular fiction. One of the things, one of the arguments he makes in Race and Resistance is that there's a ton of Asian American literature that's just, it's like, does it, do you resist or do you assimilate? It's kind of like that can get old, right? It's like being stuck in this sort of narrative bind. And so I think some things that are really interesting going on in terms of popular fiction. I actually just set this long list to Meg Benke, and I of course can't really remember anything.
Well,
Jeannie Lin is.
Maybe you can forward it to me.
I absolutely can. Jeannie Lin is a really interesting writer who crosses romance and science fiction. Sherry Thomas, I highly recommend. Science fiction. Oh, everyone should read, if you haven't, Charles Yu's book Interior Chinatown, which uses the format of the television script. That's an incredible book. It won the Pulitzer, I think. Wow. So those are some of my recommendations. I think they end up doing really interesting things with form that help kind of break out of just can't defeat structural racism, so I guess I'll just die, right? Which is something that happens a lot in Asian American literature. So, yeah.
Okay, cool. And it would be really interesting, actually, to put those in history classes. And I'm wondering, we've got a few minutes left, so I want to pretend that you are Meg Benke, only you're Erin Young, provost. And maybe I'm not Nathan Gonya, acting officer in charge, or whatever these shifting titles are. So we're going to create a curriculum, an Asian American Studies curriculum. So what's going to be in it?
Yeah. Well, you have Asian American history, which is super important, right? I've got I would like to offer more than one class of literature, which would be really nice. I would like to see a foundational, at least, introduction to Asian American studies as a field. And that's where you can get, a lot of that activist background and the grassroots stuff. Asian American film, art. I mean, there's all kinds of interesting things happening that, I hope students would take the courses. But yeah, I think I've also thought, a couple other things. One is that we should think about OERs for whatever we construct. I think that could be really cool. And then I was also thinking, the college could really use ethnic studies as well. And we have the faculty to put together something like that, where you can actually see the connections between groups, in American history. And I think that kind of thing would be really important as well. What do you think we need?
I think those are really interesting suggestions. I do some of that foundational Asian American studies work in Asian American history, but it would actually be interesting to spin that off and put that into kind of a separate course or even just a separate short module or something that students could take and do more history and also look more transnationally, kind of like follow more immigration
Asian
paths.
diaspora.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then language. I keep thinking you brought it up with the Alaska Natives, but language, how does the idea of being bilingual or being denied the opportunity to be bilingual, which was
Right.
sort of my history, how does that
Oh, mine
inform?
too, actually.
Really?
So,
Wow.
so you only speak English?
Yeah, because I joke about this, I studied Hindi in grad school. But, like every other language I've studied, I lost it because I had no one to speak it with really, and
Oh, of course, yeah.
not a lot of time and incentive to carry it on, so
Right. My mom in the 70s had such terrible experiences with her accent, and she thought if she never spoke Korean to me, that I would just have an easier experience with English and just fitting in. And
yeah.
so, and she really regrets that now, of course, and understands that the language acquisition doesn't necessarily work that way. But at the time, she didn't. And so, yeah, I'm also English only, which is an
Yeah.
interesting thing as an Asian American to be an English only speaker.
It makes us it puts us in an interesting place in literature too, because it means that how we write excuse me.
Mhm.
I've been talking to students all day.
Yeah. I always lose my voice those kinds of days.
Yeah. But how we write in our first language, which is English, is often judged as, you speak English really well or you write
Oh, yeah.
really well in English. Well, of course we do. We're born and raised in it, and we
Right.
our craft carefully over the years.
Absolutely.
But language is there's so many ways to at least learn basics of language now through apps, through relatively inexpensive programs, and I'd
That's
like
true.
to kind of see some of that brought into curriculum.
Right, right. That makes a lot of sense, actually.
Yeah. But anyway, we should talk more about this. For now, we're actually out of time, and so I do need to kind of sign us all off. But thank you really very, very much for such a stimulating discussion. And thank you, everyone else, for joining us at the Asian American Herald tonight. I'm Himanee Gupta-Carlson. My guest has been my colleague, Empire State College Professor of Literature and Cultural Studies, Erin Young. The Asian American Herald is a Facebook-based news media outlet dedicated to discussing topics and building community among Asian Americans in the capital region of New York and beyond. So have a good evening, and I will see you again all next Thursday. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
You are so welcome.